What's up, guys? 8-Bit Wizard here, and today I'm gonna be going over if statements and teaching you the basics of if statements. So an if statement in Python and every programming language that I know is used to control the flow of your program, right? So for example, we'll do some print statements, right? So we'll say that example 1 is equal to 5 and example 2 is equal to 10, right? So these are just variables with the values of 5 and 10 in them, but now comes the flow. So to start an if statement, you just write if, and then you write your Boolean statement or your conditional statement, right? So for example, if example 2 is greater than 5, okay, then you put a colon to separate your if statement from the commands you want to run if that if statement is true. So if example 2 is greater than 5, or you can even do example 1, which would be the more Pythonic way, and then you could just say print. What do we want to print? We'll just do example 2 is greater than example 1. Close it off, save and run that, and you can see that it prints out. So now, well, how do you test multiple statements, right? Because we only have one, but let's say you have like 5 different statements you want to do. Well, you could just do if and write a whole bunch of if statements, but with Python there's something called elif, which is basically a combination of else and if. Okay, so with that elif, we can do if example 1 is greater than example 2, what do we want to do? Well, in this case, we just want to print out example 1 is greater than example 2, right? And so let's go ahead and change our variables, and we'll do 15 so that it's greater. Save and run it, and you can see that now example 1 is greater than example 2, right? But what happens if they're equal to each other, right? So if we save and run that with them both being 10, nothing's printed out. Well, that's because with our symbols we're doing greater than, and that's it. They're not greater or equal to, so it doesn't test for them both being the same value. Well, what do we do then, right? So we can do an else statement. And what is the else statement for? The else statement is for if statements. It's the default if statement. So for example, you can have your ifs, your elifs, however many you want, and at the very end you put your else statement. If your if statements and elifs, if your conditional statements don't match, then the else statement runs as the default. So else print example 1 is equal to example 2. Save and run that, and we can see that example 1 is equal to example 2, and it works. So what else? You can have multiple if elif statement too, and this is actually the more Pythonic way to do it. Instead of doing if, and writing a whole bunch of if statements, you do one if, and the rest of your conditionals that you want are elifs, and then you include your else at the end of your if statements. So let's see. Let's go ahead and write in another one, right? So example 3 is 15. So with this, basically we're just writing another elif statement, but what I want to do is change this one to 11, right? So let's save and run this, and I'll explain the result. So we see that example 1 is greater than example 2, right? And if we look, that is actually our second elif statement, right? Or our second if statement. We can see that I changed example 1 to 11, so now example 1 is greater than example 2, but example 1 is also less than example 3, right? So why did it print out, example 1 is greater than example 2? And the reason for that is because in if statements, when you have multiple, it runs through them, right? So it goes to the first one, is example 2 greater than example 1? No. So it moves on, right? And then it tests the conditional statement, is example 1 greater than example 2? Yes. And so it stops the if statements from running. The ones beyond it, it stops it. Once it finds an if statement that's true, it stops, right? So that's why in these if statements, once it found the one that was true, it printed it out and it stopped from running the other ones. Now you can have multiple different blocks, like I can have another if statement here and it will run it, right? And see, this is also why using elifs are the more Pythonic way, right? So if you do if statements and don't use elifs, then basically it acts as if it's a different part of the statements, right? So it goes if elif, well, elif is true, so it prints it out, then it runs if below that, and that's also true, so it prints it out, right? Using elif stops that from happening. Basically, it controls the flow. So like these statements are grouped together, and it controls the flow of your program if you use elifs. When you type if in another conditional, that starts a new group of if statements, basically. So just remember to use if, elif, and else, and separate your if statements if you so choose. Another cool little trick I want to show is we'll do example 1 is equal to 1, right? And we'll say if example 1 print true, right? And so it prints true. And so cool little trick. I strongly advise though that you use your operators, right? So your comparison operators to do your if statements, unless you're just trying to test a variable, right, and its value, and then run it. But if that's the case, you should use the equal operator or a different operator. But what this does is, in programming and just other stuff, 1 and anything above, right, is true, and if it's 0, it's false. So, for example, we'll save and run that, and nothing prints out. So 0 is false, 1 is true, and yeah, that's it for this tutorial. Hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or whatever, need some help with understanding this, leave a comment down below, and I'll do my best to help you. And yeah, see you next time.